Welcome to my channel. I'm Stan, and one of the most common questions that I see online is people asking for assistance and help on making decisions on what lenses they should buy. Alright, I bought my camera, now which lens should I go for? So today I'm here to discuss the basic and the rule of thumbs, the principles, the things you should be aware when you decide to choose your lenses, and what lenses should you choose and what you should have in mind when you do that. I wanted to discuss first in general what are the attributes and how you should use those attributes of any lens in making the best decision for you, depending on the style of photography you're shooting, or whatever business plan you have, where you want to find yourself in the market. So all of this depends on how you prepare and how you diligently do your research, and hopefully this video will answer you and will help you in making those decisions. So I'm going to start with a list of attributes of the lenses and comment on each of these components. Yes, so first, for a lens, it's one of the metric for a lens, the attribute, the main one is focal length. What does this focal length? This is important because depending on the subject you are photographing, the focal length will allow you to capture more within a frame. If it's a wide lens, or if it's a zoom lens, it will allow you to go closer to your subject and also compress the background. So I'm going to give you some examples, right? If you have estate photography, you'll need to give an impression a lot of speciality, a lot of room, a lot of space available within a house, within a particular room that you're photographing. So in that case, you will make a choice for wide angles lens. You can start with 14 millimeters, 11 millimeters, all of this on full frame sensors. I'm talking about, yes. Then you can go further. Astronomy, the same. If you think you're going to photograph a lot of, you're going to do a lot of astrophotography, then you can consider both a super telephoto lens or zoom lens, or you can consider a wide focal length. For instance, I'm using the 24 G Master 24 millimeter that I'm filming now on. This works good enough for astrophotography. If you go even farther, if you think about street photography, usually you'd use a 35 millimeters. You'll start with a 35 millimeters prime. You can use a 50 millimeters. All of these I'm talking in the light of the full frame sensor. And then you can combine it with street photography. You can combine it with portraits as well. So 50 millimeters would work well for portraits as well. It's probably one that's in between 35 and the next one, which is 85. So the most common focal length for portraits is 85. You will see that for a lot of portraits. You will use that, the 85, you'll use it in a lot of portraits photography, in weddings, fashion. So the 85 millimeter has been there for a long time. It's very well known focal length. It's very common option, choice for most of the people that are doing portraits, and it's very good because especially when you are photographing humans, or your subject can have different distances to your lens, and depending on where your focus you want to be, we want it to be very sharp within your lens. These lenses can bring some distortions. So, and in some cases they are desired, in some cases it will not flatter your subject. So you would not want, for instance, in a human being, if you use a very wide lens and you get closer to the subject, the nose will start to look bigger and bigger, and it will produce the fisheye effect, which you'll have to correct in post. Not all of them are very easy to correct in post. So all of these things you need to keep in mind if you want to. That's why 85 it's a very good choice for portraits, because it's very close to what you see with your normal eyesight, and it doesn't adjust, it doesn't affect the view of your subject. Then you can go further, 105, that's a very good focal length again for portraits. The more you get closer, the more separation between your subject and the background happens, and also the background gets compressed, so whatever is in the background comes closer to your subject. So that's good. Again, you can use it also in landscapes, for instance when you have mountains or a dune of sands, or a new one to compress and have different layers within the same photo. So it's not necessarily all the time you use a wide focal length for landscapes. Going further, 135, that's a good choice again for portraits, and then you need to think about 200, again 200 millimeters, and then even farther for wildlife. You definitely need a lot of distance between you and the subject, so then you go 200 to 600 millimeters. It all matters what type of photography you are going to use the most your camera in, and what are you going to use your camera in. That's what you should buy your lenses for, to make the most of it. Now, we also have prime lenses and zoom lenses, so there are two discussions there. Can briefly discuss that. In general, the prime lenses are sharper because they don't have movable parts, and also the distortions are much better controlled because of that. While for a zoom lens, where you have various or customizable or between a range of focal length, you will have a moving part within the lens itself. So when would you buy one, when would you buy the other? Well, depends again what you're shooting. So if you have time at hand, a prime lens is very good for various reasons. The performance you get with the prime lens is very sharp. Sometimes the focus is a bit faster. But it will also, another advantage is to force you to be more creative with your composition, with the framing, because you don't have that luxury to sit down and just zoom in. It forces you to go closer to the subject, so you can, or farther, or depending on whatever your focal length is. So these are the advantages of the prime. However, if you are shooting in a very high dynamic changing environment like a wedding, when everything happens very fast and you don't have time to prepare for the shot, then you would use a zoom lens. What I mean by zoom lens, then that gives you the possibility to have different focal length without you having to change the lens within your body, so on your camera body. So that's when I would choose a zoom lens. I've got 28 to 75 Tamron, and that's the only time I'm using it. It's for weddings. Other than that, I'm using primes. So on top of that, any lens can also have OS or IS, or image stabilization, or optical stabilization, or VC. Particular vendors call it differently, vibration compensation. So on top of that, what that adds to your features of the lens, it allows you to capture the scene with a much lower shutter speed, or with longer time. So you expose the sensor for longer time without you shaking the camera, because it has image stabilization within the lens, without you getting shakes and blurred images. So that could be helpful. Again, depends on your subject. Remember, it's just helping you with your personal hand shaking. So whatever blur you get from moving your camera, it doesn't help you if the subject is moving. So if the subject is movable, it's like action, like horse riding, or football, or tennis. Or if your subject is moving, then the image stabilization won't help you. You still need to reduce and have a very expose your sensor for a very short amount of time, to reduce that time. So depending on all the situations, the image stabilization will not always help you, right? So you need to remember that what's the trade-off for that is usually the lenses with image stabilizations are not as sharp as the one without. So you will see more and more the latest vendors now are releasing lenses without image stabilization within the lens itself. Canon still has it for a lot of their L lenses, but the good news is the newer camera do have image stabilization within the body. So IBS in-body image stabilization now compensates for the fact that you don't have the image stabilization within the lens. So you can kind of make the best of both worlds. You get the best sharpness, the best performance optically within the lens, and then you have the image stabilization at the body in your camera, yes, which is the case with Sony Alpha series and in general. So all of them have built-in image stabilization. Canon is promising to bring that as well in their mirrorless camera. So these are the things you need to be aware of. I've just touched now on the focal length. I'm going to move further. The next one is the aperture. So what's the aperture your lens can, the range your lens can vary its aperture, and usually most people are concerned on the lower end of the spectrum where the aperture is open at the max, so the lowest number that a lens can go, and the lower the number, the depth of field is smaller, so it allows you to create that beautiful professional separation between your subject and the background, where you have that smooth transition between your subject and the background, and that's called bokeh. So the beautiful bokeh, the better the separation, the smaller the depth of field that's given by your aperture. The smaller that is, the more creative you can be with your photography, yes, depending on your focus points. However, please mind that influence is also the other end of the spectrum, when you could need it for landscapes, right, or for night photography, if you are shooting particular long exposures, or astrophotography. So if your lens starts at, let's say, 1.4, it will not necessarily go to f30, right? So if it starts at 2.8, it can go to f30. So the more stops, right? That depends on the internal design, internal architecture, how the R&D, the research and developers have thoughts, and how many blades they have incorporated within your aperture. Now, one thing I want to mention for the aperture is, don't assume the apertures are dictating the amount of light which reaches your sensor, definitely, but it's not the same between multiple lenses and multiple vendors, and that's the f-stop, and that's a different discussion, right? So you could use f1.4 to 2 lenses, but you will see in particular conditions, in the same conditions, the same light amount of light in your frame, but your ISO, if you leave it on auto, you'll see it will change to balance the metering, yes? So it's not always the same amount of light between the 2 lenses, and even more between different vendors, right? So that's on the aperture side. Now, the smaller the f number, usually the harder a lens is to be built, and the more expensive it is. So anything under 2.8 aperture usually is considered a pro lens, and that's what usually where the price goes up as well. In general, most I've been talking and referring just to prime lenses, but for a zoom lens, you can have variable aperture. So at one end you can have 2.8. When you go to the telephoto end of focal length of the lens, you can end up in 3.5, 4, 5.6 and more aperture. So, and then you have the more expensive zoom lenses where that aperture is constant throughout your focal length range, yes. But again, you can't have very low number for a zoom, so usually that's 2.8 I'm talking about the full frame. Yes, you can have sometimes less for that for the crop sensors, APS-C. So now we're talking about, I've already touched on with or without IS. When should you buy which one? Usually I choose without image stabilization within the lens. That gives me better optical performance. Please mind that the image stabilization, while it's helpful, also will drain on your battery consumption of your camera, because you need that image stabilization to be on as soon as you start focusing. The next one would be sharpness. The sharpness of a lens. This is a lot of there is a lot of discussion. Usually the photographers are very hyped and discussing about, have you seen that lens? Have you seen that lens? Have you seen how sharp that lens is? That's very close related to the resolution of a lens, but not necessarily. It's also close related on how accurate the lens focus is, right? Obviously now you have different, depends also on the camera, which method of focusing it's used on the camera. It's contrast based, is phase detection. So a lot of things come into play here to dictate the sharpness, right? In the DSLR, the legacy professional cameras, you would use a different method than on the mirrorless, which is now on the sensor, which is much more accurate. So it's not always down to how sharp a lens is. But I'm assuming your focusing and micro focus adjustments are set correct. You know how to use the camera, you know how to use which focus methods to choose and so forth. So everything is calibrated, every tolerance matches. So the body tolerance of the camera matches with the lens tolerance, everything matches and binds together well. And now we're testing the sharpness, we're discussing about the sharpness. Depends again on what subjects you are photographing, right? So I'm going to give you an example. If you're photographing a ring, then you would appreciate a lot of, or commercial photography, a lot of sharpness, right? So that's why you're using a macro lens. Well, that's one of the reasons. So in general, the macro lenses are the sharpest, but they're slower on the focusing speed, on autofocusing speed. Yes, that's another component, an attribute of a lens, which I will discuss later. But you see, you want to think about autofocus accuracy. So for instance, on DSLR, when you're using third-party lenses like Sigma on the Canon, the accuracy was not that good as a native Canon lens, right? Because particular vendors did not have access to the code, or Canon has not shared that openly with other vendors, right? So how the focus system works. So a lot of these third-party vendors have tried to do reverse engineering and to get their lenses work with Canon. So back to our discussion, the sharpness. I'm going to give you another example. In a wedding, would you like your 85 to be the sharpest lens possible? Not necessarily, because that would give you a lot of work when you get, especially when you're getting the bride photos that you need to work on and edit and post-editing, where any photos where ladies are in general, they don't prefer to see all their details on their faces. They want the softness to be there. So you might find it helps you better for a lens that gives you not that sharp images in that situation. So that's something to think about it, right? And I know there are wedding photographers that are using particular 85 lenses just for that reason, to help them with the post-editing, to reduce that time of editing, so before they hand the photos to their customers, and their customers love it. So that's one of the things that you need to keep in mind on the sharpness, right? Then autofocus speed, I've just discussed that. You have a sharper lens, but it's not necessarily the fastest. It depends a lot of the internals of a camera, what motors or engines are used. Now Sony is coming with the latest general GM lenses like the 24 and 135. They're very fast in the focus, very fast in the autofocus speed, and they're using a different technology inside for the motor, so it's a linear motor. There's a lot of details there. I'm not going to get much into it. Vignetting, that's another attribute which has a good side, when I like to mention it. So sometimes you pay a lot of money to have a small vignetting for within your lens, especially when the lens is, obviously that usually happens when it's fully open, so from lower aperture 1.4, 1.2 to 2.8 in general, and then after that there is no vignetting at all, vignetting into your photos. But it's interesting, after you've finished and you corrected, you apply all of these corrections. Obviously they can be applied within the camera as well, but in your post-processing then you add some software vignetting to kind of draw the attention of your audience into the center of the image, to your subject. So I just wanted to mention that sometimes we need to be careful of what we really are whining about and discussing about. It's like you go to the gym driving, and then you're running on the treadmill for 30 minutes, but you could have run to the gym or walk to the gym instead of driving there, right? So it's the same thing here. Another component is chromatic aberration, and that might not seem too much of a deal, because you can easily correct it in post. For instance, like Lightroom, they have profiles where their engineers will know how to detect that in a photo, but usually that happens when the lens is opened, is wide open with the aperture, so like 1.4, 1.2, 1.8, 1.6, and you are shooting in the silence, so the sun is coming from behind your subject. That's when you'll start to see the chromatic aberrations. But I can tell you, it can be very, very bad in some lenses, that it can ruin most of your shots, and you can't practically use it fully open. So it's something that you should think about it in your decisions. This is one of the things I would keep on my list, how the amount of chromatic aberrations. The other type of aberrations, like the fish or pillow, or they can, in general, they're not that bad, and they can be corrected relatively easy, so in post. So but this one, it's CA, chromatic aberration, is something to keep in mind. The next one is the weight. The weight of a lens, it doesn't seem too much of a deal, but it matters if you're shooting, for instance, weddings, or you're shooting sports, or you're in a situation where you need to be with your camera of, let's say, 6-8 hours or more per day. You need to be with that camera in your hand. So if that's the case, you need to think of the weight of a lens, because what's the point in buying a smaller body camera, like a mirrorless camera, and then you still have a big lens which is weighing a lot of. So I'm just going to give you an example. I've been to Wimbledon, and I had my 70-200 Canon image stabilization Mark II, which I used with the A7 III with MC11. It worked well, but it was very heavy. That's over 1 kilogram, right? So and I'll get to that discussion. So the weight is something to have in mind, especially when you're shooting weddings or an event that's spends over a few hours, more than 4 hours. You will definitely appreciate a much lighter lens. The next one is the build. The build of a lens, it's important, especially if you are shooting outdoors, because you want your lens to be weather resistant. And God forbid you ever drop it. Yes, you would mind. Thank God I've never dropped mine, but you never know. So the build, it is important. So think about the build of a lens as well. The warranty you get with a lens, it is important. Again, there are some vendors, third-party vendors, they would give you 3 years Tamron, they'll give you 5 years Tamron, and Sigma as well. Sigma will give you 3, Tamron will give you 5, so 2 particular lenses, which is very important if you think about it. So just keep those things in mind. It depends obviously where you're buying the lens from, and make sure it's not the grey market, it's a local lens, otherwise your warranty will not be honored. The resolution of a lens, depending on what type of photography you are shooting and the camera you have, the resolution of a lens, the resolution a lens can render the image with, it is important. So for instance, you can have, the moment I'm shooting most with Sony Alpha A7 III, that's 24, that has 24 megapixels. So that's not a lot. So in most of my lenses will meet that and even surpass that resolution. But imagine you go for the R series A7R, yes, where you have the 60 over 60 or over 45, R2, R3, R4. So in that case, you need to make sure your lens can generate at least close to what your sensor size resolution, maximum resolution is. So you need to think of how can you find that out. You can go on the XO Mark and you can do all sorts of online tools. Are people that have tested and they estimate or measured the resolution of a lens, and then you make sure the lenses you are buying are matching to your body. Otherwise, you invested too much in one side, and there's no point in having a 60 megapixels sensor and shooting always at the highest resolution in RAW. But your lens can give you 18 megapixels image, so there's no point in that. So try to balance the resolution of a lens with your sensor, right? If it's bigger, that's perfect, because you might upgrade in the future. So you can still keep your lenses and upgrade your body to a higher resolution, to a camera that has a higher resolution sensor. And lastly, but not at least, is the price or the value. I'm always looking, what do I get for this money on this vendor? What do I get for this money on that vendor? Is it worth the difference? And I'm gonna talk on that on an example. So I'm gonna bring here this lens. It's Sigma. It's Sigma 135 1.8. It's a beautiful lens, and it's used for portraits most of the time. So that is a great lens. However, Sony has come out with a GM 135 whose reviews are amazing. So it's a very good lens, and I'm thinking, I've spent a lot of time, made my research, is it worth buying the Sony, which is, depending where you are, $500, $600, $700 or pounds. It's more expensive, some even more than the Sigma. The Sigma was rated as the sharpest lens until Sony came, and I've done a lot of research. The sharpness is not much difference between the two in the same conditions on the same camera. Where is the Sony winning is mainly in the focus, autofocus speed. So if you were to shoot some events or dynamic subjects like sports, then the Sony probably would win in most of the cases. You get a higher rate of in-focus photos. But usually 135, which is a prime millimeter focal length, is not used for action. It's mainly used for portraits. In the portraits, I don't mind. I'm waiting a few milliseconds more on my Sigma, right? The weight, it's another part where the Sony wins. It's just 100 or so, just a bit lighter than the Sigma. And the other part is that you have also the button that you can configure, and the variable aperture, manual aperture that you can use if you are shooting video. I'm not shooting video, so when I looked at overall performance, yes, the Sony has a little bit more contrast if you're shooting in the sun compared to the Sigma. But other than that, if you take two photos of the same subject in the same conditions using the same camera, but with these two lenses, Sigma 135 and Sony 135 GM 1.8, and you put them side by side, you will find it very, very difficult to tell the difference between them. So other than what I've mentioned, there is no difference. So for me, it was a very clear decision to make on this. I've just chosen Sigma, and I'm very happy with my choice. So that was just an example for you to make you understand what I meant by price and value, price versus value. that you need to keep this in mind as well. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for following me. Thank you for watching me, and I hope you found this video informative. And my channel, it's still an educational channel, which is what I aim to be. Thank you for your time, and hope to see you soon.